I'm so glad to be joined by my two friends who are also coming from influential media from the African continent, Thando and Nancy. I will leave to both of them to introduce themselves. Nancy.
Hi, Tian. I'm Nancy Illoh-Nnaji. I'm the executive producer and anchor of Moneyline with Nancy on African Independent Television.
And Thando, coming from South Africa.
Yes, my name is Thando Maeko, and I'm from South Africa. I'm a political economy reporter at the Business Day, which is South Africa's most influential business and finance publication.
And both of you are part of that leading media figures coming from different parts of the world, especially from developing countries. Well, my home organization is the official media partner for this forum. So why are we so interested in something which many people consider as abstract global trade? Nancy.
We're talking about global trade. Africa, for example, has one of the lowest figures in terms of global trade. Thando would agree with me that even as Africans, we don't really trade with ourselves. And that is why we should feature at these kind of conversations and be able to push forward. For example, it would take a lot, it's easier to travel from Lagos or Abuja in Nigeria to Europe, to Frankfurt. And when I was coming here, it took me like 6 hours, 10 minutes from Abuja to Frankfurt. But it's not easy to travel from Abuja to other parts of Africa.
Synergy of Africa through trade. It's a big, because I know African continent is designing something like a grand scheme in terms of trade plans for the next decades to come. And why for you?
I mean, the big topic for this forum, particularly at this time, is making trade for a better world. And just to hark on to Nancy's point about how difficult it is to travel just within Africa, I think it also reflects the trade routes within Africa. Not only is it difficult for people to move within the continent, but it's also difficult for goods to move within the continent, and that also impacts on trade relations within the continent, but also trade relations that the countries within the continent have with other trade partners in other parts of the world, such as the EU, the US, Asia, China. Yes. It's a particularly important time, I think, to review these trade relations, to make them better.
How do you see the latest interactions, China and Africa, as a media leader from your country, for example, with the FOCAC and all the business deals that are being signed, investment possibilities?
I must say this is even, our discussion is coming at a very timely time, because our president, Nigeria's president, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, was just in China a few days ago, where he met with your president and the prime minister, and they had fantastic and fruitful conversations around nuclear energy, infrastructure, media exchanges. China has really also gone far, very far in terms of development. Coming back to Nigeria, a lot of investments are being done by Chinese companies, for example, part of our infrastructure. I know you also have the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. How can we, perhaps as a country, Nigeria, be part of it? I think Nigeria joined, in 2018, if I'm not mistaken. So how do we begin to advance Chinese-Nigerian relationship beyond what we have? But coming back to Nigeria, what we would also like to see is perhaps more handshake in terms of more collaboration, in terms of knowledge transfer, because the Chinese have done so well for themselves. You guys have done so well. You've pulled a lot of people out of poverty. And also listening to the DG of WTO, she mentioned that the proportion of poor people in the world have reduced from about 40% to about 22%. And China was part of that, huge part of that. So you guys have taken a lot of people out of poverty.
Just to hark on that point, I think that it does really present an opportunity for us as media writers and media workers to work within this South-to-South context and tell stories which are not only relevant for our audience, but also useful to our audience. I mean, it's no use of speaking of something that is far away from who your primary audience is. So I think if we prioritize ourselves and our stories, then it will put our voices louder, so that whoever may come into our jurisdiction knows that, okay, when I am here, these are the stories that I'm looking for, not in relation to what is happening in another country, but in relation to what is happening here and now. And also, it's our responsibility as well, like Nancy said.
I really agree with both of you have just said. You know, on the one hand, the responsibilities of media, both to the of officials and also the politicians and also to the public. And as you said, be able to identify the stories from our parts of the world and make sure those stories are being, how shall I say, spread around through our own strengths. But I want to emphasize another point, which is seeing is believing. We really need to visit each other's countries to discover the stories through our own eyes, because we are being, filled with all of these rhetorics that have been there for decades. But once we see a story ourselves with our own eyes, we have our own perspectives. And those stories are fascinating stories because you have never seen it in the media pool, shall we say. And we will be able to contribute.
It's also about knowledge sharing as well.
Indeed.
Within our respective countries. Knowledge sharing on methodologies, knowledge sharing on storytelling, knowledge sharing also on languages, because when you learn someone's language, you also learn, through language, you learn their culture. So it's easier then to tell the story of not only yourself, but of another person, of another culture, and to tell it truthfully as well.
As Africa, we must also be firm as to say what kind of development do we want. And we mentioned earlier on that it's not one size fits all. What South Africa needs may not be what Nigeria needs, may not be what Chad needs. There are also a bit of fragments now, even in Africa, even in West Africa. Some countries in the West, Niger, Burkina Faso, and all of that.
Diversity of African continent.
Exactly.
Africa is not one country.
Africa is not one country.
Going to South Africa, for example, last year during the BRICS summit, learned a lot, even just during a few days in your country. For example, visiting the former residence and the museum of Mr. Mandela, and understand how his legacy is creating a big debate in the country, and knowing, when developing countries are moving forward, we are reflecting back on our past, but at the same time to see what is the best way forward. So that is a very interesting story to me, coming from China. Also about South Africa, how you are dealing with the thorny issues of poverty. As Nancy just mentioned, on the African continent, there are lessons and experiences as well. So coming from a developing country, looking at similar stories, shall we say, we experienced a few decades ago, really gives very different perspectives and fresh input into the story.
And one of the things that facilitates poverty reduction, of course, is trade, open and fair trade. So I think that's why China is such an important partner on the continent. We saw that last week during the FOCAC, one of the focal issues was elevating trade relations between African countries and China, so that the goods which are exported to China are manufactured goods and not only raw products are transferred out of the African continent. And in that way, we elevate the trade and we improve relations with one another. And that has domino effects in that it reduces poverty and it helps the respective economies grow.
Disputes of trade that is going on here at the WTO between two members of WTO or multiple members of WTO. Where I come from, for example, there is one issue of electronic vehicles. As we know, green development for the developing country particularly, so crucial. China planned ahead, and the technologies are becoming ever cheaper. And also, it can benefit the overall pool of green products in the world so that SDGs can be better met. We know it is lagging behind, but anyway.
I think with the electronic stories, electronic vehicle dispute, for our African audience, the matter here is, yes, there's not a big market for electronic vehicles, but Africa still has to listen in on the dispute and has a role to play in the dispute. Why? Because the minerals for these electronic vehicles are found in Africa. So it goes back to what Nancy was saying about Africa being the bride and everybody trying to impress the bride. It creates an opportunity for Africa as well to set the trade terms.
My takeaway will be, we are seeing the light of multilateralism here in Geneva. Many international organizations are here. What is important is all the voices related to trade need to be heard, including those coming from the media. And I'm so glad to be joined by my two African sisters for this CGTN Media Roundtable here on the sideline of the WTO Public Forum. That's CGTN Media Roundtable on the sideline of the WTO Public Forum 2024. That conversation was taped in the WTO studio in Geneva. And as a media official partner with the Public Forum 2024 of WTO, we're very honored to bring you more content related to the forum in the latter days of the week. And that's all the time we have for today's Trade and Our Shared Future. In the coming days, we will bring you more on the 2024 WTO Public Forum. If you would like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of my team in Geneva and Beijing. Thanks for being with us, and I'll see you tomorrow.